Sixth question, a straightforward question and much expected question. Now discuss the geographical characteristic or geographical distribution of Homo erectus, taking into account the physical features. Where does it fit in the human evolutionary line? Right, in the context of human evolutionary line, you can write, right? You fundamentally, it is asking about what? It is asking about the phylogeny. It is asking about the phylogeny. Always remember, whenever I am writing a question on Homo erectus, there are certain characteristic features which are mandatory to be mentioned. One is the foramen magnum, the other one is supraorbital ridges, one is the nuchal crust, the sagittal crust, right? These dimensions will have to be definitely spoken about. Then apart from that, the vertebral column, the S curves which are present, and more than anything, when you look at the femur region, when you look at the pelvic region, the basin shaped pelvis is what is supposed to be written. Then in the context of femurs, you are supposed to talk about gluteus maximus, gluteus minimus. Then you will definitely see that when you look at Homo erectus as a phenomena, and when you look at Homo erectus, certain physical characteristic features, appearance of linea aspera happens to be for the first time. Right, in the human evolution, when you see linea aspera appears for the first time, then once you discuss about that, you are also supposed to talk about the medial arch which is existing, and these are the 8 to 9 important characteristic features which are definite to be written. And you are not going to stop there, you will definitely have to talk about the cultural dimension of it. The cultural dimension is what? Adoption of fire. Not only the adoption of fire, you also see the cooked food, consumption of cooked food. And automatically what happens? Whenever I see cooked food, whenever I see fire, there is change in dentition. I see that dentition slowly starts changing from prognathic to orthognathic transition. And I also see there is disappearance of diastema is seen to be happening. All of these traits are seen to be changing with respect to Homo erectus. Next, forensic anthropology. Again a favorite area. Now when you look at applications of forensic anthropology with suitable examples, there are simply the straightforward syllabus points which can be picked up. One aspect is you talk about the paternity diagnosis. The other aspect is the personal identification, facial reconstruction, right? And I also see forensic anthropology to be present for both the living organisms as well as the dead bodies. The living organisms and the dead bodies. Now in this context, I can talk about the statistical reconstruction as well as the mathematical reconstruction of a dead body. Now in the context of statistical reconstruction and mathematical reconstruction, what is that? We are supposed to talk about different indices which are supposed to be seen. The cephalic index, the nasal index, right? The cranial index, those dimensions were supposed to be discussed. Right? Talk about all of these applications and give some examples. For example, you know that one example that you can see is the Neera Bora case or ND Tiwari case, right? Or you can talk about your, what is that? Mumbai blast. Now in Mumbai blast, the individuals were identified on the basis of forensic anthropology, right? So those dimensions can be written in this context. Next, how does Levi-Strauss look at Shimian myth of Asdewall? Now many people, how many of you heard about Asdewall myth already? One common myth that we would have heard about Levi-Strauss is Cinderella, the myth of Cinderella, winner, right? But Asdewall is also one common myth that is generally observed. Now what does he fundamentally say? That again we know the core concept of Levi-Strauss is what? Theory of binary opposition. Theory of binary opposition is what is the core concept of Levi-Strauss. And when we observe this theory of binary opposition to be the core concept of Levi-Strauss, one dimension that he talks about is, he talks about a character called Asdewall. Asdewall is considered to be a superhero. And when you look at Asdewall is considered to be a superhero, in this myth he talks about 4 different perspectives. One perspective is the cosmological perspective, right? One perspective is the cosmological perspective. One perspective is geographical perspective. One perspective is the sociological perspective. The fourth perspective that he talks about is the techno-economic perspective. Now that means in this context of all of these 4 dimensions, what is he categorically saying? He is categorically saying the structure of the mind and the pattern of the mind is divided into 2 extremes, that is the binary opposites. And when he talks about the cosmological dimension, he talks about the earth and the moon. When he talks about the geographical dimension, he talks about the day and the night. When he talks about the sociological dimension, he talks about patrilineal and matrilineal. Both are extremes. And when he is talking about this techno-economic, one dimension that he says, he talks about the surplus and he talks about the deficit. Right? Now, the myth goes like this. Ashdewal is supposed to be a superhero and who has married, and when he sees that his wife and mother-in-law has been struggling for food, what happens is Ashdewal comes across a bird, and when Ashdewal comes across a bird, he feeds the bird instead of feeding the mother and the wife. And in that context, what happens? The bird which has come and which has been fed by Ashdewal happens to be a wonder bird and blesses them with surplus. That means, what is the myth that is observed here? That I see a binary opposition of surplus and deficit which is seen, right? That simple description. Then immediately once you talk about that, they are asking about the structural analysis of myth. Now when you look at structural analysis of myth, the Levi-Strauss categorically talks about what, my dear? Levi-Strauss categorically talks about, he says that myth is nothing but a symbolic narrative of superhumans with extraordinary events. That is what is the definition of myth that has been given by Levi-Strauss. And when you look at this, he says every myth has a basic unit called my themes. I can divide the myth into multiple my themes. That is, my theme is nothing but the basic unit. And for suppose if this is the myth, each of this is a my theme. And the nature of the myth will fundamentally depend upon the arrangement and rearrangement of these my themes. If I change, now for suppose if you look at your serials or if you look at movies, what happens, my dear? In fact, the underlying story of most of the movies are same. Avana, Devara. Right, we see somebody is born, right, somebody is fighting and somebody is turning into a messiah. That is what is one fundamental dimension that you observe in Devara. And there is some arrangement and rearrangement which goes on. And depending upon this arrangement and rearrangement, the myth and the story changes. That is what is the basic analysis of Levi-Strauss. Right? That might be in the context of Cinderella story also. He talks about my myth is nothing but arrangement and rearrangement. But one dimension is you will have to bring in some perspectives of Edmund Leach. Because Edmund Leach categorically talks about what? Theory of opposition and mediation. He doesn't talk about alone the binary opposites, but he talks about opposition and mediation. And when he is talking about this opposition and mediation, any society which is seen to be existing, it never exists in a static composition, but it is always seen to be maintaining an oscillating equilibrium. That means it might be oscillating between these two, but the resultant is what? The resultant is the median, the oscillating equilibrium. Now for suppose when Edmund Leach is studying the Highland Burma, the political structure of Highland Burma, he categorically says what? One side it is Gumlao, one side it is Sham, the oscillating median is Gumsa. This is what is the field work that has been done by Edmund Leach in the context of Highland Burma. So that means no society is static, it is seen to be oscillating in the similar manner. I see myth is also seen to be oscillating. So that is one perspective which has been given by Levi-Strauss and Edmund Leach in this context. Next.